Now I hope you know, you soon will know, that your design for your project is coming due fairly soon. 2 weeks-ish, I would think, on that order. Bring your materials to class. I mean, I would imagine most of you have it, could have it on a thumb drive or email it to yourself or something. There's also a great application called Dropbox, not to be confused with Angel's Dropbox, but allows you to put files up in a little space that you can use anywhere, and that's pretty good. But at some point, we may discuss your progress on your project or have time to work on it beyond ordinary lab time. So, sort of from now on in, bring your stuff and bring your questions to class. Questions that you have about your project will be very important, so please don't hesitate to ask them. You may think that the question that you have really relates only to your project and not the class as a whole. Let me make that decision, because if you ask a question, it might be that the rest of the class would benefit from hearing the answer as well. Or maybe not, in which case I'll say we'll discuss it during lab. So either way, no big deal, but ask the question, and we'll go from there. This week what we're going to do is we are going to talk more about positioning. We've talked about several different ways of position currently. Absolute positioning, relative positioning, and flow positioning. And we're going to talk about floating today. And that is one of the trickier concepts, at least in my mind. When I first learned it, it was a little confusing. And in fact, even now, occasionally, it will surprise me when the layout behaves a certain way. But we'll go over that, and then we'll sort of mix and match, because it is possible to sort of take elements of these different things and combine them together in new and different ways. So that's sort of on the agenda today. So over the next few weeks, over the next couple weeks, more layout, your project, and then we'll probably get into a discussion of tables in HTML. So we're going to talk about floating today. And we're going to do sort of like we did last time, where we're going to have sort of a play example before we get into something that's really meaningful. And let's go and copy this. And yeah, I know the projector isn't on. I'm still trying to figure out what it is I want to do. All right, let's create a very simple page that has two divs in it. Div 1 and Div 2, which I seem to remember from a Dr. Seuss book, but I digress. All right. We're going to put them up here with no styling whatsoever other than some colors, because we want to be sure we see these and know where each div is. All right. So let's go and view this. And the only styling associated with this is the colors that I've assigned to the two divs. I have not put any positioning. And therefore, they simply appear like the flag of France. Is that the flag of France? No. The France, the stripes are oriented vertically, I think. Yeah. But that's probably the flag of somewhere. If anyone knows, leave me an email. But at any rate, because they're in the flow, all right, layout. And again, what's the flow layout? The flow layout is sort of what we did from just the beginning of class. All right, from the beginning of the semester, where you have one element that simply goes one right after another. And so therefore, because I haven't done anything with the layout, I haven't said position absolute, position relative, position fixed, I haven't assigned any of those things to it, it therefore will lay out in this order. All right? Just one after another. These the div tags are block tags, so therefore they're stacked right, just one right on top of the other. Now, even if I assign a width to these, so let's assign a width of them, and let's make div 1 200 pixels and div 2 400 pixels. They're still going to be stacked on top of each other because the layout is still the flow layout. So I've made them smaller, right? But they still stack one after another because I haven't done anything with the layout of those. All right? So it is using the flow layout. Notice that the H1 no longer goes all the way across the screen. And the reason for that, again, is because the H1 is contained within the div. So if I put a width on the div, effectively that also puts that same width on the H1. Because with no width on the H1, the width defaults to 100% width, and therefore the H1 extends all the way across. We could more or less prove that if I gave a different color to the H1. You'd be able to see that. All right. What if I wanted these next to each other to line up like that? All right. That's what I can use the float for. The float works on this principle. And in most of the examples, we're going to float to the left. That's the way that usually makes sense. You can float left, top, bottom, and right, but typically the floating is done to the left. I have a window that is a certain number of pixels wide. For the sake of argument, let's say it's 800 pixels wide. I put in the first div, which is 200 pixels. If I have the next div, if I specify for the next div, or if I specify this div and the next div to float to the left, what it will try to do is push that div right alongside of it. All right? Push it towards the left. Now, students might get confused by this because if I float this div to the left, it actually is going to end up to the right of this. But again, picture it sliding in, moving to the left until it hits up against it. Now, one of two things will happen. Either there'll be enough space in the window for it to fit, or there won't, right? So, for example, in this case, I have 200 and 400 pixels. That's a total of 600 pixels. 600 pixels will fit within 800 pixels. So, if I float these to the left, if I float both of these to the left, this guy is going to end up there, and this guy is going to end up right underneath, right alongside of it. All right. Now, what happened if the window was smaller? Let's say I dragged the window and I made it 500 pixels. then that 400 pixel would not fit alongside of it, in which case it will drop it down and put it here. All right? Sounds a little tricky. Let's play around with this. Let me put both of these in here, and let me specify for both of them float left. And there they go. The window is, I would say probably 1,000 pixels, give or take. Whoops. The window is 1,000 pixels, give or take. All right. This one's taking up 200 pixels. This one's taking up 400 pixels. Therefore, 600 pixels fits within 1,000 pixels. So it put the first div and slid it from the left as far to, or slid it towards the left rather, as far over as it could slide it. It did the same thing with the next one, and it first tried to put it on the same line, but it could, right? Because there's approximately 800 pixels of space here, and this is only 400 pixels wide. So it was able to slide that alongside next to it and have it appear on the same line. Now, what if we made this, let's say, 900 pixels? What would happen then? It drops down below because there are not 900 pixels there, right? If this is approximately 1,000 pixels, there's approximately 800 pixels going remaining. So it tries to slide it towards the left, but it can't fit it in the 800 pixels, so it drops it down below. It gets even more involved when you resize the window. So I'm back to 600 and 400. All right. Within 1,000 pixels, that fits fine. All right, that fits just fine because there's 200 for this, 400 for this. That would leave about 400 left. All right, that 400 can fit in the 600 that was left, or rather the 800 that was left after I took out the first 200. Now, watch what happens as I resize the page. At a certain point, it pops down below. At a certain point, there's no longer the 400 pixels left to put it there, and therefore it drops it down below. All right? Now, what's the implication of this? The implication of this is you could make for a wide monitor a 2-column page, a page that had 2 columns worth of information in it. And if they were viewing it on a smaller screen, or if they were viewing it on, let's say, a mobile device, it would shift into a 1-column. Let's go in, and let's grab some Greek text to maybe demonstrate this. So let's generate 2 paragraphs. And I'll make this my first paragraph. And I'll make this paragraph 2. So, I could put those two things side by side, and it appears side by side until I got so small, and then it would appear stacked vertically onto each other. And again, that may seem goofy when you view it in a desktop browser, but if you think of viewing this in a desktop versus a mobile browser, it all of a sudden starts to make kind of sense. All right, the fact that, yeah, for a mobile browser, I want it to be one column, whereas for a desktop browser, I might want it to be two columns. Let's go and let's even these columns out. Let's just try to make this look a little bit more like a normal page. So I'll go and I will make both of these 400 pixels, and I will get rid of the colors. But I'll give each of them a border. There we have these two paragraphs that, at a certain point, they become stacked on top of each other. At a certain point, they can fit side by side, stacked. Questions about this? Now, we did this with an absolute size. In other words, we made this 400 pixels. All right? At which case, we can pretty much predict exactly where it's going to collapse, right? Because essentially, when it gets less than 800 pixels, there's not going to be enough room for the second paragraph to be alongside of it. So it will drop it below. Now, one thing to remember, though, is that your padding and margins and border, all that, works in there, too. So in other words, it might actually be at 800. It might be more like at 802 or something like that, or maybe even less because it looks like there's sort of a default padding in there from the browser. So it might not be exactly at 800 pixel width. It might be more like 810 that it collapses. In most of my examples, I'll use sort of just an approximation. I'll say at about 800 pixels, meaning take into account the border and the padding and so on. Now, I could also give percentages to these if I didn't want to do an absolute number. So I could say the width of each of these is 40%. In which case, watch what happens. Because I'm not doing an absolute number anymore, all right, as I make it smaller, it's able to keep it together for a longer period of time, right? Because the width is no longer always going to be 400. The width is going to be 40% of the available space. That being said, at a certain point, it's going to go and overlap. That's one thing that I suppose is a characteristic of these floating layouts, these liquid layouts, is that at a certain point they are liable to, sort of melt down. Now the question you have to ask yourself is anyone ever legitimately going to be trying to read the page at a screen resolution smaller than this? I don't know what that is, but it is pretty small. All right? In which case, probably not, and so I'm probably okay. Now, let's go back to an absolute number, and let's go in and put the number at 400 pixels and 400 pixels again. right there is where it collapses. Notice if I start throwing in a padding and a margin, it'll collapse sooner. So if I go in and throw in a padding of 10 pixels, at the screen size I'm currently set at, it fit without the padding. If I add the padding back onto it, notice now it drops down below. Remember, the padding expands the total width of that block. In other words, when I define a width, if I specify that a box has a width of 400, and I add 10 pixels of padding, that's actually making the total width of it now 420. Because it's not like it takes that 10 out of the 400. It adds that 10 to the 400. Likewise with any border I give and any margin I give. So as I add border and margin to this, all right, there it is with the padding. If I go in and make the border 10 pixels, it's going to, again, add to it. So even though it fit without the border, when I add the border, it makes it so that it doesn't fit anymore. And likewise, if I add a margin onto these. All right, no longer fits where it fit before. Why? Because all these things that I'm adding, the margin, the padding, the border, add to the overall size of it. So it's going to make it float down at a screen size where it used to fit before. Now, if you look carefully at this CSS code, you'll notice something. And that is the style for div 1 and div 2 are exactly the same. All right? As I was going in and adding to the style, which I now just realized you didn't see anything that I did the last 3 minutes. But as I added to the style, the padding and the margin, again, it collapsed at a larger size. So as I added margin and padding and border, it didn't take quite as long for it as I was making the window smaller for it to pop down. If you look at the styles for div 1 and div 2, you'll notice that they're identical. All right? Oftentimes, it's not a good idea. Well, let me rephrase that. One of the principles of good programming practice is DRY, do not repeat yourself. All right? And essentially, what I've been doing here is, as I've been changing the style rule, trying to get this down, I've been making two styles match each other exactly. So in other words, I'm repeating myself. So, for example, if I want to change the color of the border for both of them to this, and put a background color of this, I have to do that in two places. anytime in coding, whether you, and again, this doesn't matter. This doesn't just apply to CSS or HTML or the web sort of languages that we use, but really in any kind of coding, whenever you're doing the same thing, the exact same thing, more than one time, you should ask yourself, is there a better way to do it? All right? There won't always be. Sometimes there isn't a better way to do it, but a lot of times there is. And the way to do it in this particular case is to use the CSS selector of class. Now, we haven't talked about the CSS selector of class yet. We've talked about the CSS selector of HTML tags, right, where you put in an HTML tag and that HTML tag gets that style rule. All right. We've talked about the CSS selector of IDs, where we've said the thing on the page that has an ID of this gets that style rule. A third selector is by class. And the difference between class and ID is pretty straightforward. All right. Sometimes this is confusing for students, but I don't really think it's that confusing. An ID should be unique. And by unique, I mean there should only be one thing on the page with that ID. All right? So, I shouldn't have two things on the page with an ID of div 1. Right? An ID is like, your identification number, your ID card. What would it be like if two people had the same student ID? It would be crazy. It wouldn't work. All right? Class allows for duplicates, allows for two things to be given the same class, and then they're treated the same way. For example, student ID defines a particular student, a single student. Each student has their own unique student ID. So an ID identifies someone specifically. If I gave a class to students, I could say, for example, graduate students versus undergraduate students. I could say PSEO students versus non-PSEO students. I could say students that were CISS majors versus students that are not CISS majors. Well, in all those cases, those are classes, and they're not necessarily unique. In other words, there's not just going to be one graduate and one undergraduate. There could be multiple graduate students and multiple undergraduate students. So, what I could do is I could change this. Instead of having a different style for each of the two IDs and making sure that they match up, because you know what's going to happen. At some point, you're going to make a mistake and forget to change one. They'll no longer match up. I can assign a class to it. And let's say this is part of an article. So I can assign a class of article to this. I can then go in and define a class on the HTML tag that says, hey, this div is part of the class article. Now the difference again, to repeat, notice that the style rule for the class starts with a period instead of a pound sign. The pound sign is for ID. All right? The period is used for class. A class is not necessarily unique, so I can have multiple things on the page that are given the same class. And then I can assign that class by saying class equals and then the name of the class. So now, when I'm done, still works, but if I were to change something about this, let's say I want the background back to white, I only need to change it in one place, and that change will affect all my paragraphs. Or I'm sorry, all of my divs that I've given a class of paragraph. So now, we have a mix and match. And we have three basic selectors for CSS that we can apply in different ways. We have HTML selectors where we put in a tag where we want everything on the page with that tag gets a style. We have the class where those things we assign the class to gets the style. And I didn't do a good job. I tried to circle the circle the S. Things. In other words, with the class, it's more than one thing. Finally, with an ID, the thing singular that has that ID gets the style. So we can style all instances of a particular tag a certain way. We can style some instances of a particular tag that way. And lastly, we can style one individual tag or one individual element that way. And we can mix and match, and they cascade and all that. Let's go over a little example of mixing HTML tags with IDs and classes. I'm going to save this example for now, and I'm going to go and make a second. Go make a second page. That has a bunch of paragraphs in it. Now, a couple things to realize. In most of my examples, I use divs because divs are sort of the big blocks of the page, the big sections of the page you work around. But everything I'm talking about for CSS really applies to any sort of HTML element, at least to any block tag. I'm going to make a page that has a bunch of paragraphs on it. All right. And I didn't put any style on it, so all of them look the same. Didn't put any style on any of the 5 paragraphs, so all of them look the same. Okay? Now, I can go in my style section and put a style on the P tag. And I can say background background of a light gray, color of a dark gray, and a 1-pixel solid black border. So, because all I've done is defined a style for P's, every P on the page will get that style. Notice there's no dot, there's no pound sign, so that's a style rule based on this HTML tag. So, it could be a div, a paragraph, a link, whatever. But all the paragraphs are going to get that style. So if I look at this, all right, that's what I have. All the paragraphs get the same style. Now, let's say some of these paragraphs are more important than the others. All right? I can give some of these paragraphs a class of important. And then I can assign a style rule to important. And let's designate that they're important two different ways. All right? Let's give them a different border, and let's give them a bigger font size. So I'll say important border 2 pixels, red, dotted, font size 1.5 M. All right. Because I've assigned that to the class of important, I can assign 3 different paragraphs that class, and all 3 of them will get treated the same. So all 3 of the first 3 paragraphs have the different border on it and have a bigger font size. Now, notice though what color, what background color, and what text color those paragraphs are. They get, even though they're of a class of important, they get the same background color and text color as the regular paragraphs. That's the cascading part of cascading style sheets. And the way cascading works is if there's more than one selector that applies to a particular element, the more specific that selector is, will take precedence over the less specific selector. So, for example, in this case, there's a border for both paragraph and a class of important. All right? This element is a paragraph, and this paragraph has a class of important. So really, both of these style rules apply. All right? However, the border of the important class takes precedence over the border of the paragraph HTML style rule because the class is more specific than the paragraph. All right? In other words, the P tag says every paragraph gets this. The class is a little more selective. Only paragraphs with a certain class get this. So that's more specific, so that will take precedence. However, notice that there is no color or background on the important class. Therefore, those paragraphs get the P, get their colors from the P style rule. All right? So if I make the background or the color of this, let's say, blue, that changes every paragraph, right? Even the ones that have a class of important. Why? Because important doesn't have a style rule for the colors. So therefore, the style rule for the colors of the paragraph sort of cascades down and covers those paragraphs. So, thing to remember is that when you define style rules with the selectors, especially when you mix and match paragraphs and classes and IDs, more than one style rule can apply to an element. And the more specific a style rule is, will cause it to take precedence over the less specific. So therefore, these guys get the border that's associated with the important class, but get the colors associated with the paragraph task, or paragraph tag selector. Now, Let's muddy the water further. And let's go in let's say the first paragraph is a summary of the article. I can give it an ID of summary. And then I can go in for summary and specify color of green and a border of 4px dashed purple. So now, these paragraphs simply get the P style rule, right? Because that's all they are. These paragraphs get a mix of the P style rule and the important class style rule. All right? This first paragraph gets a mix of all of them. It gets some of its style rule from the P tag, some of it from the important class, and some of it from the summary ID. The summary ID, given that an ID identifies just one element on the page, is the most specific. So anything defined on the summary will take precedence over the other two. So, someone describe to me what the summary paragraph is going to look like. What will the border be of the summary? Yes?
It's going to be purple.
Yeah, it's going to be 4 pixels wide, it's going to be dashed, and it's going to be purple. All right. What is the background color of the summary paragraph going to be?
Gray.
The background color?
Gray.
Gray? Specifically, what shade of gray? C, 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 C. All right, 6 C's. What will the color of the text be? Green. All right. What will be the font size of it? 1.5 M. All right. How did I know that? Well, I look. For the ID, is there a mention of the font size? Nope. So it won't get the font size from that one. For the class, is there a mention of the font size? Yes. Therefore, it will get that one. So again, this is sort of the cascading part of the cascading style sheet. All right? You can define things on multiple levels. You know. And why do you do this? In this case, I'm just doing it sort of arbitrarily. We're sort of talking about the technical aspect of it. You do it to show some sort of meaning. All right? And you can notice this even in magazine articles or newspaper articles or whatever. Sometimes the first paragraph is bigger than the rest of the paragraphs. Then they'll have the rest of the paragraph smaller. All right? Sometimes there's a sidebar, whereas there's a main story and then there's sort of a sidebar with like some additional facts about the story and so on. You don't apply these techniques just randomly, just for the heck of it. Again, in this case, I'm doing it specifically to demonstrate something. But when you actually do this, you do it to achieve some sort of consistency and indicate some sort of meaning. So, for example, you may put, the main paragraph, give it an ID and give it a bigger font so it really stands out. You may give a sidebar or some additional information you might put in a different border and a different color so it's set aside from the rest of the article. All right? You don't, again, do these things just for the heck of it. You do it because the color and the border and all those things send visual signals to the person looking at the page. If you see 2 paragraphs on the page that are styled identically, your mind sort of equates them, right? They're of the same level of importance, they mean the same sort of thing, and so on. If, however, you have a page where all the paragraphs look the same, but one is in red text and in italics, your mind automatically says there's something different about that paragraph. All right? And it might be a warning. It might be, who knows? But your mind immediately knows, even without you reading the content, that there's something about that that stands out. All right? On your Lab 6, I finished grading the Lab 6s that were turned in. And there's some people that did a reasonably good job, but they used a very flow-based layout where they just had one thing after another. All right? And on those, I commented that that layout really doesn't do anything to sort of give the reader or the user visual cues about how your page is organized and designed. That's why we're doing all this. Let's not put the cart before the horse. You know, we're spending a good amount of time discussing how to make these style rules work and how to make the layout work, etc. But let's keep it in the front of our mind why we're doing this. We're doing this because we're using sort of a visual language, you know, by our choices of fonts and colors and borders. We're sending signals to the user about the content that they decipher without even thinking about it. So that's why in this case, when I gave these classes, I indicated like why you might differentiate. In other words, those first 3 paragraphs are given a class of important because, yeah, these are the more important paragraphs in this article. The first one's given an idea of summary because it is the single summary of this article. All right? In fact, you want to do that. You want to indicate with your IDs and your classes why you're giving them a class, what they mean, instead of simply saying like, you know, red border or something like that. All right? Well, why are you putting a red border on it? Oh, I'm putting a red border around it because this is a warning. Well, then you should give it an ID of warning and not an ID of red border. You might choose later on to show a warning a different way. All right? Now, in this example, again, remembering I'm using an internal style sheet. In reality, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to take this and put it in an external style sheet. And by doing so, everywhere on my site, the summary is going to look a certain way, the important paragraphs are going to look a certain way, and the regular paragraphs are going to look a certain way. Think how powerful it is to give that level of consistency. As someone were navigating through your site and looking at these different pages, they're getting the same signal on every page. That a dashed purple border means it's a summary with green text, and so on. Now, obviously, I'm picking sort of dramatic color changes to really make it stand out. But even if you do it more subtly, you're giving the user a consistent message, and effectively you're teaching them how your page is structured and organized logically, and that will help them find what they need to find on your page. So let's go and look at this sort of to wrap up here. And again, there's the green text, purple dash border, but the font size matches the other font sizes of the important, and the background color matches that. So really, this first paragraph, that is a paragraph that has a class of important and it has an ID of summary, gets bits of its appearance from all 3 of those style rules. All right? The second 2 paragraphs get bits of its appearance from 2 of the style rules, and finally, the last 2 paragraphs get its whole appearance from the 1 style rule. All right. I wanted to talk about classes today. I probably spent more time than I thought I was going to on that, but that's okay. We're in good position as far as time goes. Next time what we'll do is we'll sort of bring these 2 ideas together, the floating and the classes, and we'll make some actual layouts, not just these sort of exercise pages, but we'll make some actual layouts using everything that we know that involve floating elements on the page. All right, we'll see you over in lab.